Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is a new installment of Gimme 10. Gimme 10 is a series in which I spotlight 10 different records of a specific genre or style. And recently I've been listening to a lot of electronic music, notably synthpop, Detroit techno, house music, a little bit of ambient techno. And I would like to do specific genre videos about those styles. And I thought as a prequel, I would do kind of a roots of electronic music, notably 80s electronic music. So the records that sort of inspired the whole scene. Now, please note, I wasn't alive at that time, or at least barely alive. And so it's only what I've read or heard or watched on the scene that sort of informed my list here. But I think, more or less it's quite accurate, even though I wasn't a personal eyewitness to this whole movement. Without further ado, I'm going to show you 10 influential records to 80s electronic music and beyond. And the first one is this album by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So in case you don't know, you've never heard of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, it was founded in 1958. Obviously, it's an arm of the BBC. It's a lab in which composers, electronic composers, were given free rein to make basically library music or sounds for TV shows or ads. Notably, they did the music for Doctor Who, which was etched into the consciousness of a lot of British young people and older people too, I guess. This is a clear first kind of like major influence when you come to think of electronic music in the 80s. The children of that generation heard these quirky noodling on various TV shows. Notably, we're talking about Delia Derbyshire, who is undoubtedly one of the key figures of in this BBC Radiophonic Workshop. She's at least the most well-known of all them, and so you could arguably say that this was the first kind of foray into for the British public, into electronic music. The second record that is worth discussing, or the second artist rather, in the same vein, I'd say, is Wendy Walter Carlos, and I think it's probably more prominent on the Clockwork Orange soundtrack. I do not have a copy of that soundtrack, but at least with Switch on Bach, you get the idea. This is the best-selling classical record of all time, and for good reason, because it's wild and inventive and very imaginative. So Walter Carlos at the time composed this eccentric piece of Baroque music on Moog, which is a monophonic, at the time was a monophonic synth. And so you'd have to play each note, one note at a time. You couldn't play chords or anything. And so it's a feat of human resilience more than anything. And the music is very quirky and, almost instantly memorable when you've heard it. Every household just about has a copy of this. And it's so very avant-garde and so very inspired, and I guess, for generations of electronic musicians, that was probably one of their first encounters with this music. And in the same vein, I have to talk about Kingsley and Perry, Jean-Jacques Perret and Gershon Kingsley, who more than dabbled into this kind of music, the Moog specifically. And the tune that obviously cracked Gershon Kingsley into the mainstream is Popcorn, here in its hot butter cover version, but originally it was it's one of his compositions, and it was appeared on a Moog album to start with. This track is universally known because it's very simple kind of ditty, very memorable. But it had, for what I can gather, a very, very deep impact on generations of of musicians who heard this and thought, well, I can make music. Um, I remember hearing Phil Oakey from the Human League. He was talking about Wendy Carlos and saying that the moment he heard those notes on the Clockwork Orange soundtrack, that his life changed completely. That he knew what he wanted to do, and I guess you could say the same with a record like Popcorn, because it's it is this the very beginnings of mainstream electronic music. Then I have to talk about the German school, obviously, because that's a huge point of influence as well. And there is no bigger influence here than Kraftwerk. Of all the records that I'm going to mention today, this is probably the one that sort of, I've selected Autobahn myself because I think the opening track, the side-long self-titled track Autobahn, is really pretty much, it is synth-pop, but before its time, 1974. Adam McCluskey from OMD said that he went to see Kraftwerk in Liverpool, and the next day he sold his guitars and bought synths, which just tells you how much this band was, absolutely changed the game in many different ways, in hip hop as well. If you listen to, Planet Rock, it changed the game for techno as well. Very, very influential in the world of Detroit techno. These guys, these Germans, one of the first bands, if not the first band, to only exclusively play electronic instruments, which was very unconventional at the time, and singing in German by choice because of a very mechanical sound of the German language to almost dehumanize the whole experience, to be a bit more mechanical, and to bring a sort of a coldness to the music overall, which was intended. So I think Autobahn must be cited as one of the main influences of electropop, synthpop, techno. A lot of electronic music that we now take for granted. I also need to mention Tangerine Dream. Now, I could have chosen Phaedra, which is arguably more influential, but to me, Rubicon is just as important, and it's a phenomenal record. Really, it's a dreamy soundscape. It's sort of like it's a prequel to things like vaporwave or chillwave. It's layers of synth. Edgar Froese, complete and utter genius. And this was released on Virgin Records, the Richard Branson label. So this was widely available in England at the time, and so along with bands like Faust and Henry Cow, which were widely distributed in England through Virgin Records. The German records, these records would have blown people's minds. I could talk about Can, obviously, but I'm not going to. I'm going to talk about this fabulous Japanese band, the Yellow Magic Orchestra, the trio of Harumi Yosono, Ruichi Sakamoto, and Yukihiro Takahashi. And these three guys just are the symbiosis that is undeniable, and one of the absolute main influences on the electronic sound of the 80s, because they were basically the Kraftwerk of Japan. And I've selected Technologic because you know, the title says it all. It really is, an early version of, electronic techno music, but done, in the style of the days with the equipment of the time. And it's interesting to know that, like Japan made the instruments really. So, these people were probably first-hand experience on all these, incredible synth by all these amazing brands like Roland and Lin, and and what this has got, Yamaha synth and the like. So, beautiful stuff. A French record that changed the game is Oxygène by Jean-Michel Jarre. This man should be viewed as the equal of a classical composer. What he's done, growing up in France myself, these melodies were pretty much etched in our minds. Really, 1976, Oxygène Part 4 is really where it's at. But this is a symphony using just like ARP, ARP synth, AKS synth, Farfisa organs, mellotrons, the works, and just absolute tour de force of, and this is an album you could get just about anywhere, which is fabulous. Moving on to a more sort of rock-based territory, and I would like to speak about Roxy Music, because whilst Roxy Music were more an art rock band or a glam rock band, they were the first band featuring Brian Eno, and Brian Eno's, addition on this record is really his keyboards, which give it a real, very much futuristic touch to this music. I mean, this is a classic record, obviously. Do the Strand and what song is Street Life? No, sorry, Beauty Queen, The Bogus Man, For Your Pleasure, 1973, an absolute masterpiece, really, by Roxy Music. But also, I'd imagine that teenagers in Britain at the time would have seen Roxy Music on Top of the Pops and been that sort of blown away by Eno's noodlings on his keyboards, and I'm sure this constitutes a very strong point of reference for electronic music further, as does Low by David Bowie, notably Side 2, which is this ambient suite of song with Warsaw, Art Decade, Weeping Wolf, and Subterraneans. All these tracks are just beautiful Krautrock-esque ambient tracks, recorded in Berlin, obviously, and for good reason, because that's what he was inspired by, and again, a huge influence on people like Gary Newman, who fashioned himself pretty much after this music. Like if you listen to Gary Newman, a little bit of Depeche Mode has these kinds of stylings. So Low, 77. Second last is obviously Donna Summer, I Feel Love. Not this record in particular, because most of it is basically second-rate soul music, but the last track, I Feel Love, Giorgio Moroder. When Brian Eno heard this track, he ran to David Bowie and he said, "The future of music has arrived," and Bowie can only agree with that. I Feel Love is a complete and utter smack in the face, really. It's got this incredible throbbing, keyboard that just it's like a propeller almost, and you have Donna Summer's vocals. So Giorgio Moroder, Italian producer in Munich, met this young American singer, and it was this kind of a match made in heaven. A feat repeated on Love to Love You Baby, which is also kind of, a very forward-thinking track in my opinion. But I Feel Love is Yeah, it is basically synth pop as we know it, you know, except with a more kind of soulful. It is electronic soul, really. And if you've never heard "I Feel Love," well, have a great time listening to it for the first time. And the last thing I want to showcase is really the beginnings of electropop in England, but this is not really it. It's kind of like on the cusp of Warm Leatherette by the Normal, TVOD, and Warm Leatherette. Now, Warm Leatherette is a track by the Normal, which is Daniel Miller, who would then go on to form Mute Records, who would then go on to release Depeche Mode and other. But this track here is absolutely groundbreaking, a mix of keyboards and I can't remember what the well, I think the lyric is taken from maybe J.G. Ballard or something like that, or something, or maybe Alvin Toffler, or something like it's taken from like a dystopian kind of novel. But this track is really one of these kind of one-off moments of genius in British post-punk. And it was covered later by Grace Jones really amazingly well too. But this proved, I think Daniel Miller, thought, well, I can never learn to play the guitar; it's too much work. But I can press a button on the synth, and this is what happens. And you get obviously this amazing, mix of, proto synth pop. So there you go. That's all I've got for you. I've spoke for too long, but I hope you enjoy anyway. Give me some comments. Talk to me. Cheers, everyone.